She was crowned beside her husband, adorned in gold, draped in silk, and instructed to smile. But the moment he died, that smile was no longer expected, it was feared. In medieval Europe, a queen without a king was something far more dangerous than a grieving widow. She was a woman who knew too much, owed no one her loyalty, and had nothing left to lose. People whispered of poison, of secret alliances, of sons raised to avenge. They mourned the king, but they watched the queen closely, because some women were more powerful alone. He was not yet cold. The halls still echoed with priests chanting and nobles weeping, but their glances had already shifted, not toward the tomb, but toward the woman dressed in black beside it. She had walked into the chapel as a wife and walked out as something else entirely. In medieval Europe, a queen's power was defined by the man beside her until he was gone. Then, her silence became unsettling, her memory threatening, her mere presence a political calculation. For while the body of the king was buried with fanfare and gold, his widow remained above ground, alive, intelligent, and in possession of every secret he never wrote down. She had heard every negotiation whispered behind closed doors. She knew which noble families had lied, which foreign kings had begged for favors, which sons were not truly sons. She had memorized the map of power because she had helped draw it, and now, with no husband to restrain her, that map belonged to her alone. Courtiers kept their distance, unsure whether to offer condolences or loyalty. Priests spoke of grief, but with hesitation, as though her sorrow was not genuine or not enough. Even her ladies-in-waiting tread carefully, aware that in the days to come, allegiances would be remembered. The Dowager Queen, as she was now called, could not take the throne, but she could bend it. If her son was young, she might rule in his name. If he was old enough, she might whisper in his ear until he believed her voice was his own. In some kingdoms, the Queen Mother was honored. In others, she was watched like a snake behind glass. And if the marriage had been cold, if the king had fallen ill too quickly, if the physicians had been summoned too late, then the whispers turned darker. They called it the widow's touch. The idea that a queen might poison her husband was not new. It was old enough to be expected, old enough to be feared. Whether it was true did not matter. Once she had lost her king, she became something else, an unpredictable force, shaped by memory and sharpened by survival. The court called it mourning, but they kept their distance, because the black veil she now wore did not soften her. It protected her. It warned them. And behind it, a queen waited. She had been silent for years, not because she lacked opinion, but because queens were expected to watch, not speak. At court, she had smiled through treaties she hated, bowed to enemies she recognized, and entertained ambassadors whose names she would one day use as leverage. Now, with the crown shifted from her husband's head to a golden casket, the silence became power. Every man in the room wondered what she remembered, and worse, what she intended to do with it. A widowed queen was no longer decoration. She was history personified, and in the cold machinery of succession, history could be the sharpest blade. She had sat beside the king during war councils, had held maps in her hands, had comforted soldiers' widows with practiced warmth while noting which generals cried at the wrong moments. She had walked the corridors after midnight, heard things through stone walls, received letters meant for other hands. Queens were trained to appear idle, but nothing in their world escaped them. In grief, she kept her eyes lowered, but behind that veil, her mind moved swiftly. Especially if her husband had left a child too young to rule. In those cases, she became regent not in title alone, but in authority. She signed decrees. She approved appointments. She summoned generals and dismissed them. She became the living channel between the dead king and the boy who would become one. But even when her son was grown, the fear did not fade, for it was often she who decided what kind of king he became. Some whispered that a queen mother could turn a boy into a tyrant, or a coward, or a puppet. If she whispered into his dreams, who could stop her? She had raised him, fed him stories, shaped the way he viewed the throne, the sword, the crown. And when foreign dignitaries arrived, they did not just ask to see the new king, they asked what his mother thought, because many knew the truth. He wore the crown, but she remembered how it had been forged. It was not uncommon for a widowed queen to be accused of witchcraft, not because she used herbs or spells, but because she understood men and how to move them. She could praise with one breath and destroy with the next. Her alliances were older than the king himself. Her network of loyal servants, ladies, informants, and spies had been built over decades. And now, with no husband to limit her presence or dismiss her warnings, she moved freely, carefully, quietly. Every smile was a strategy, every condolence a potential command. They called her dangerous, they called her cold, but what they feared most was this: she had survived. When the king died, most expected her to vanish behind black curtains, to weep and fade. Instead, she remained. And in remaining, she became the one thing the court could not predict, a woman who had once held the ear of a king and now held the future in her hands. She wept when he died. Of course she did. The chapel walls rang with the sound of her mourning, her face veiled in black, her hands clasped so tightly the rings dug into her skin. But as the incense curled upward and the bells told their solemn rhythm, the courtiers did not look at the king's lifeless form. They looked at her, because in the stillness of grief, a single question began to rise like smoke through the marble halls. Had she helped him die? In medieval Europe, poison was not just feared, it was expected, especially when the wife outlived the king, especially when she had reason. She knew the herbs. All queens did. Their education included tinctures for fertility, oils for sleep, powders to calm a restless child. It was not far from healing to harming, just a change in dose, and queens had access. Access to kitchens, to goblets, to physicians who answered not to truth, but to the throne. A man who weakened suddenly was said to have sickened from within, but behind every pale brow and bloodied cloth, the court whispered another word: widow, not as victim, as cause. It did not matter if the king had been old, or ill, or already dying. If he died too fast, she was blamed. If he lingered too long, she was blamed. If she showed too much grief, it was called performance. If she showed too little, it was proof. The queen could not win, but perhaps that was the point. Because fear was useful, it protected her better than any guard. There are letters, recorded in court documents and private archives, that describe queens who were never accused formally, but were spoken of with a reverence edged in dread. One wrote sweet verses after her husband's death and had his enemies imprisoned by morning. Another was said to walk the gardens with her late husband's cup still in her hand, not as keepsake, as warning. And so, when she stepped into the great hall draped in mourning lace, the courtiers bowed lower, not out of respect, but out of caution. She had outlived a king. That alone made her dangerous. The black veil became more than a symbol of grief, it became a mask, a barrier, a shadow through which no one could see her thoughts. And behind it, the possibility of poison lingered in every word she spoke, every cup she poured, every servant she dismissed. Whether she had killed him or not was irrelevant. The fear was the same, and fear is power. In kingdoms where armies were expensive and swords were slow, poison remained the most efficient weapon. And the queen, the quiet woman who dined alone, who read prayers by candlelight, who said little and remembered everything, was the one who might wield it. Not because she enjoyed it, but because it worked. The throne was no longer hers, but she still sat like it was. Not on the dais in the great hall, but in a colder, quieter chamber, surrounded not by nobles and knights, but by shadows. After the king's death, she was moved to her own wing of the castle, or in some cases, to an entirely separate estate. They called it a courtesy, a place for reflection. But everyone knew what it really was: containment. A widowed queen, left to rule her own court, was both too respected to banish and too dangerous to ignore. So they placed her in palaces of silence, lavish, remote, and full of listening walls, and they watched who went in. The widow's court was smaller than the royal court, but in many ways more powerful. It was made of those who owed her everything and had nothing to lose. Ladies-in-waiting who had followed her since childhood, maids who knew every drawer in the king's old study, foreign advisors who were loyal not to crowns but to coin and to the woman who held their secrets. Some of them had witnessed royal infidelities. Others had managed the delicate accounting of bribes and blackmail. Together, they formed a court without ceremony, but not without influence. Messages still left its walls. Gifts still arrived. Decisions were still made. Only now, they were made in whispers. In the king's absence, the queen's chambers became a second center of power. Nobles who had been snubbed by the new ruler sought her out in secret, hoping for favor, or forgiveness, or revenge. Some came to her as sons, seeking guidance. Others came as cowards, looking to escape justice, but all of them came with caution. Her mourning veil might have covered her face, but it revealed everything else. Who bowed low, who dared to meet her eyes, who lingered too long at her door. She kept records, not on parchment, in memory. It was in this isolation that many queens became most feared. When denied the throne, they created their own kingdoms, castles of silence, thrones of memory. They no longer needed to speak in public. They only needed to suggest, to raise an eyebrow, to look away when someone's name was mentioned. In some courts, the queen's silence could stop a wedding. In others, her presence at a funeral meant that someone had fallen out of favor. And still, the rumors grew, that she hosted late-night councils with foreign lords, that assassins were seen near her gates, that a page boy had vanished after delivering a letter. Truth rarely mattered. Power fed on suggestion. And she, more than anyone, understood the value of being underestimated. They had removed her from the center, but they had not removed her reach. Her court was quiet, her halls dim, her face hidden, but her will intact, and no one, not even the new king, could be sure what she would do next. They called it a retreat, a quiet estate by the edge of the kingdom, surrounded by woods too thick for war and halls too cold for comfort. The queen was sent there after the mourning period ended, not banished, not imprisoned, simply removed. There were no chains, only distance. Her chambers were furnished in velvet and stone, her garden trimmed by foreign hands, her meals prepared with precision, but around her, the world had emptied. No advisors, no counsel, no men of rank, only guards at the gates and women inside, maids, nurses, widowed ladies, girls too young to be married and too clever to be trusted elsewhere. It was a castle of women, but it did not feel free. It felt watched. In these remote estates, widowed queens were expected to fade, to pray, to preserve their dignity in silence. Their voices were meant to soften with age, their ambitions dissolve like smoke, but that was never how it worked. Castles without men did not remain quiet. They became mirrors of the world that had tried to exile them. Queens kept their habits. They wrote letters sealed in wax. They kept maps beneath their beds. They walked the halls with measured steps, remembering who had crossed them and who had not. And they ruled, if not with titles, then with influence. Because even in exile, a queen was still a name that made people pause. Some castles became cradles of resistance. Within their walls, discontented nobles found shelter. Foreign envoys arrived disguised as pilgrims. Servants who had once worked in the royal palace now carried messages hidden in folded linen or sewn into hems. One widow raised 3 sons to claim different thrones. Another funded an uprising with the gold gifted to her in marriage, and yet the court called them harmless, decorative, devout, as if grief stripped a woman of her memory, as if silence meant surrender. There are records scattered, guarded, half-burned of widowed queens who ruled more in exile than they ever did in marriage. Women whose influence expanded after their husbands' deaths. Women whose names never left the tongues of those in power, even years after they were sent away. Some died alone, their curtains drawn and their windows shuttered. Others died with a servant at their side, whispering last instructions. But some outlived everyone who had feared them. They saw the kings who had replaced their husbands fall. They watched sons rise and fall. They witnessed kingdoms crumble and new ones emerge. And when they finally passed, their rooms were emptied, their belongings sorted, their letters burned, as if silence could undo what had been done, as if memory could be erased by distance. But those castles remained, stones soaked with secrets, rooms that never warmed, halls that echoed with footsteps long after the queen was gone. Because you can exile a woman, You can remove her crown, but you cannot make the world forget what she knew. A queen without a king was supposed to become harmless, holy even, draped in black, framed by candles. Her body now belonged to God or grief. But that illusion shattered the moment she bled again. The court whispered first quiet, nervous speculation. Then the advisors stiffened, and the new king's eyes narrowed. Because nothing threatened a throne more than the possibility that a widowed queen might still bear children. Not just children, but heirs, bastards, claims, bloodlines that could rise in rebellion with a single breath. The womb of a widow was not a tomb, it was a battlefield. In medieval Europe, widowed queens were not expected to remarry unless sanctioned by court, and even then, it was rarely for love. It was for strategy, for peace, for silence. But behind closed doors, these women were still young, some in their 20s, barely past girlhood, others in their 30s or 40s, seasoned by power but not yet dulled by age. They still had bodies the court could not control, and the idea that those bodies could carry a child, not of royal approval, sent waves of panic through the corridors of power. Because a child born from a queen's will, not the state's, was not a blessing, it was a threat, one that could fracture alliances, unsettle borders, or split crowns in two. So they were watched. Servants were rotated frequently to prevent loyalty. Chamber doors were guarded by men sworn to report anything, any sound, any visitor, any rumor. Midwives were interrogated, and physicians were carefully chosen for their discretion or their fear. In some cases, queens were subjected to monthly examinations disguised as wellness visits. In others, their letters were opened and rewritten. A widow who laughed too brightly, who glowed too suddenly, might be quietly accused of treason, not for words, not for weapons, but for the secret of her body. And there were consequences. Some queens were quietly removed from court altogether, their estates changed, their servants replaced, their names erased from records of succession. Others were accused of sorcery, seduction, or madness. Anything to explain why a woman might resist being still, might continue to live, might still hunger. The most feared were those who bore children in silence. Infants hidden in forests, raised by loyalists, passed between monasteries. Some lived long enough to make claims of their own. Others vanished before their names could ever be spoken aloud. Because in the eyes of kings, a womb was never just flesh. It was a forge, a place where wars began not with armies, but with a single name written in blood. And when that name did not match the king's, when it came from a queen's choosing, the fear turned into fury. They called these women reckless, dangerous, unnatural. But behind every accusation was a single, unspoken truth. They had failed to control her, not her thoughts, not her heart, and certainly not her future. He kissed her hand the day he was crowned, called her Mother of Kings, draped her in ermine, let the court see them smile. But behind the veil of ceremony was something colder, because the moment a son took his father's throne, the woman who once held him at her breast became a liability. She had seen too much, knew too much, held too many favors in her hands, and worst of all, she remembered a version of the boy that was not yet king, a version he needed buried. In medieval Europe, the transformation from prince to monarch was rarely gentle. Even sons who loved their mothers learned quickly that affection could not outweigh power, especially if the queen dowager still had allies, lands, or influence. Every time she spoke, it could be seen as a challenge. Every whisper in her halls might carry the weight of conspiracy. And if she had supported a different heir, if she had once pushed for another child, or whispered doubts about her son's rule, then her presence became not maternal, but dangerous. Some sons simply ignored their mothers, exiling them to distant castles under the guise of rest and dignity. Others stripped them of titles, claiming fiscal responsibility. But the more ambitious kings, the more frightened ones, did worse. They surrounded their mothers with spies. They replaced loyal servants with strangers. They accused their own blood of sorcery, of manipulation, of sowing unrest. In England, France, the Holy Roman Empire examples fill the archives. Sons who turned the crown into a weapon against the woman who once wore it. Queen Agnes of Aquitaine saw her influence fade the moment her son Henry II solidified his throne. In Castile, Queen Urraca's sons fought over which one she favored, until her name became a curse. And in Byzantium, imperial sons routinely banished or imprisoned their mothers, fearing their influence more than foreign armies. A widow with knowledge of the court's deepest cracks was more dangerous than 1,000 soldiers. But perhaps the most painful betrayals were quiet ones, when the boy she raised as a mirror of her hopes hardened into a ruler who could not afford to look back, when letters stopped arriving, when rooms were emptied, when guards stood too close. And the queen, now just a mother, realized she had become a reminder of his own weakness of a time before power, when he needed her voice to steady his hands. And still, some of these women survived. They rebuilt quiet networks, protected younger children, sent messages in embroidery and prayer books. Some died alone. Some died honored, but many were simply erased, made into ghosts inside the walls they once ruled, their portraits painted over, their titles forgotten. And yet their legacy lingered, whispered in the corridors like a warning. Raise a son well, but never let him forget you made him king. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8, The Queen in the Walls? She was still there, they said, though the throne had passed to new blood, though the flags bore a different crest, though the guards no longer bowed when they passed her old chambers. She was still there in the walls, in the hush that fell whenever her name nearly slipped from someone's lips, in the faint scent of lavender that clung to the west wing long after no one had touched the perfume, in the silence of rooms no longer assigned. Because some queens did not die with ceremony, they disappeared, and their vanishing left cracks in the stone. In medieval Europe, royal widows were not always buried with fanfare. Some were simply removed too politically inconvenient to execute, too dangerous to let free. So they were locked away, not in dungeons, but in hidden apartments behind walls, rooms with no windows, no doors that led outside. Just corridors forgotten by architects and known only to the king's most trusted men. The queen was not killed, she was erased, outlived her usefulness, and then outlived by memory itself. These stories were never written plainly, but they flicker in the archives, in missing death records, in sudden transfers of power, in renovations that covered up wings of castles with no explanation, in rumors whispered by servants about meals slid through narrow grates, about humming heard behind stone, about women seen once at a window that should not have existed. One chronicler wrote of a former queen who embroidered daily in a locked tower, her tapestries burned every year to destroy any messages she might be sewing. Another told of a dowager who, when asked for by foreign envoys, was said to be away on pilgrimage, though no roads bore witness to her passing. And sometimes, when a new queen arrived, she was warned not to ask about the one who came before her, not to look too long at the portrait in the gallery with eyes scratched out, not to question why the chapel's west aisle was always locked. She was told it was for her protection, that some stories were not fit for a woman of her station, that old griefs disturbed the peace of the court. But still, late at night, some claimed to hear soft footsteps where none should echo, or to find a white hair on a pillow in a room that had been closed for years. In one estate, a young prince insisted he had seen an old woman walking the halls, wearing a crown made of cobwebs. The nursemaids hushed him. The court chaplain wept. The queen in the walls had no tomb, no marker, no name carved in stone, and yet she endured, not as legend, but as an ache in the bones of the place. A reminder that in kingdoms built on blood, it was often the quietest disappearances that haunted longest. The walls remembered her, even if the world chose not to. If this story unsettled you, it was meant to. Power does not always wear a crown, it sometimes vanishes behind stone walls, whispering from the dark. For more forgotten truths from history's shadowed halls, subscribe to Forgotten Stories Ancient World, like this video, and turn on the bell so you never miss what should have stayed buried.